This is Ruth Smith, and I'm the, the Master Gardener Program Manager for UNH Extension, working with volunteers throughout the state who get trained as gardeners to help in community gardens and public gardens around the state, and help folks be better gardeners and treat the earth in a way that's a bit more sustainable. So Julia, you want to say hi?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Julia Peterson with New Hampshire Sea Grant and UNH Extension. And I typically work with communities on their water resource protection and their climate adaptation. However, I've been with the organization for a long time and really appreciate how much our volunteers are out in the community and often on the front lines, right, of extension work. In terms of engaging with external audiences.
Great. So Julie and I are going to share with you today a wonderful program that we developed over the last couple of years. But before we do that, I just want to thank Volunteer New Hampshire for having us here today. The theme of the conference is collaboration, and I don't know how many of you attended the keynote speaker this morning, but talking a lot about belonging and building a beloved community, and that ties in so nicely with what we're going to be talking about today. And we'd like to tell you a little bit about UNH Extension to start with, and some of you may be familiar with that, but we are part of the university, and let's see what's happening with the slides now. Julia, do you want to start running those? Great. So yeah, we are part of the university. Extension is, back up a little bit. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. Extension is really the community arm of the university. So we're out around the state. The extension from campus to community is what we like to think of. And we have 5 different program areas that we do work in. Community and economic development, where we're helping to build resiliency in communities around the state. Youth development, which most people know about Extension. They know about 4-H, but that's one of the ways that we work with youth, one of several. We do work with agriculture and home horticulture and food and agriculture there. We also have health and well-being, and our natural resources. So 5 different program areas. We have about 160 staff around the state, both working at the UNH campuses in Durham and Manchester, and also in the 10 county offices. And we have volunteers, of course. That's why we're here today. About 4,500 volunteers around the state working in the 15 programs that are representing all the different program areas. So there's the list of the 15 programs. Many of them are out of the natural resources area, where we have folks working at identifying big trees or water quality issues, or doing trail maintenance on properties. There's also the youth programming with 4-H and STEM docents, schoolyard sites, excuse me. And then with Master Gardeners in our agriculture and gardening section, and our advisory councils and community volunteers. So we've got volunteers in all of our different programs, really making a difference. And it's just an honor to work with them. I run the volunteer manager team, and we have a crew of staff that manage all these groups. And we all feel honored, as I'm sure all of you do who work with volunteers, these folks who give so much of their time. And in fact, in 2021, our volunteers gave about 130 hours of time, and that's just what they recorded. And probably you all are familiar with volunteers that do a lot of work that don't bother to record it, and that's a problem with us too, but they're doing a lot out there and making a real difference. So we do have a quick poll that we'd like you to answer. Questions. Let's see. So I'm going to launch the poll. There we go. There's the questions, but you can see them in the poll as well. So if you can take a few minutes to, or just a couple at a time to answer these questions. Yeah. So it looks like a few of you have DEIJA or diversity training that you're already working on. Many of you do not. Some of you aren't sure. That's okay. And you're interested in initiating one. That's probably why most of you are here, because that's the answer that most of you gave. And then the third question, primary concerns about doing this. Looks like cost is a big one, so we will talk about that. Participation, we'll also be talking about that. It was a self-selected group that we worked with. Timing, format, motivation, pushback, all of those things we'll be addressing. So I think that should answer some of your questions. But if you do have questions as we go along, you can put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat as Julia is doing the presentation. So in this together is the program that we put together. And we can talk, you want to move on to the next slide, Julia? Can we move on to the next slide? There we go. All right. So one of the things we wanted to talk about was our commitment to this work: diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and accessibility, and the reason why we're doing it. We really believe that organizations are stronger when we do this work. We had a lot of work on a staff level that we're doing to make folks more aware. And as we extend out into the community, our volunteers are really an extension of the work we do. So there was a lot of interest in making sure that they got this training as well. So Julia's going to talk a little bit more now about how we did that, and then tell you about our program. Wow. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, Ruth. So Ruth set some context for the program that we developed, and I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about exactly what we did. And again, we've just wrapped up the second year of our program. So in 2019, we developed a plan for a pilot project, in part inspired by a small grant that was being offered through the UNH's Office of Diversity, Equity and Community. So that kind of inspired us to sort of like give this a try, and kind of enabled us to give that a try. So our purpose, of course, was to offer this kind of training. As Ruth mentioned, our professional staff had been, as honestly, a lot of opportunity to grow in our understanding, but we wanted to be able to share that with our volunteers as well. And our hopes were, and our objectives included, let's increase knowledge. We wanted to increase our volunteers' comfort with the concepts, some of the basic foundational concepts, and with the goal, of course, of helping the organization overall become a more welcoming organization. So with the that little original grant, which was then leveraged by two other sources of funding. So that's what's enabled us to sort of think about 3 years ahead. We had a project team of about 5 extension staff, most of whom were working with and coordinate volunteer programs, some of the 15 that you saw Ruth mention. So that team, we had one team of 5 for the first year. Second year, we rotated, some of those folks rotated through. So that enables more and more of our staff to be familiar with what we're doing here. In terms of our participation by volunteers, at least these first 2-3 years, our program is open to any cooperative extension volunteer. Anyone who is an active volunteer with extension was invited to register. We asked them to register interest, but we had a 30-person maximum because part of our goals for the program was sort of to develop something of a cohort feel in the program. In the first year, we got twice as many applicants as we could take, but that was sort of an indication to us that, okay, so there is interest in this topic. Our original plan included working with the volunteer managers to integrate, and again, this was 2019, right? Was to integrate some of this content into trainings they were already doing, or maybe host some regional workshops, something like that. And then just as we were kind of pulling our final plans together, COVID hit. At that time, we completely retooled, not so much in terms of the concepts, but in terms of how we were going to format our program and how we were going to deliver. So we finally were able to launch the program in 2021 with an entirely remote delivery. We offered the program from mid-January into April, which tends to be when some of the volunteer programs are a little bit less active. We evaluated the 2021 pilot and then made a few modifications for this year, and then just offered, and I'm just wrapping up our second year, the 2022 program with 30 additional volunteers. In terms of what that program looked like to our volunteers, I'm going to switch screens here for a minute and show you. All right, so we used what's called a flipped classroom approach. And we broke up our content into, and we used this online learning platform. It's called Canvas. It's something that we have access to through the university. And our program consisted of, it takes about 3 months. And we had 8 modules that happen at typically 2-week intervals, except for the first one, which includes an overview and make sure that everybody's comfortable with the learning platform and with the technology. We have a set of group agreements, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. And in the idea behind the flipped classroom is that at the beginning of the module, the students are presented with some materials, learning materials that they cover independently. For example, when we got to our social identity and culture module, participants would click on that link, and there they would access a video. Here's some information about terminology, some graphics to help understand concepts, optional material. Then they were invited to comment on what they were learning and what they were thinking about through an online platform. And then at the end of that 2-week module, that's when we would actually have live presentation and discussion with one of our presenters. So that's what the platform looked like that the participants would look at. In terms of group agreements, I'm going to show you just an example, and I'm sure many of you already have these in your organizations, and that you use them sort of as either ground rules or just sort of guiding principles for when you have discussion among team members. So this is just an example. There are lots of different examples, but these help create an environment and a climate where people are encouraged and feel free to express their thoughts and get into discussions. All right, I'm gonna look back here. Okay, so in terms of the actual content, so we worked very hard and worked with some folks at UNH, but to figure out how we wanted to scaffold these concepts and how we wanted to present them, because as many of you know, there's lots of information, lots of material, but we wanted to be very careful about how we scaffolded them, recognizing especially that, of course, volunteers, right, typically adults, often experienced adults with many life circumstances, and probably attending this from many points of view and from many levels of experience. So we worked with, here's our list of presenters for 2021. And then our list of presenters for 2022, we had to make some changes based on availability of folks, but very similar. And in 2022, we added a new content area. So most, if not all of you, as you can see, of the folks that we worked with are associated with the University System of New Hampshire. We were very, very lucky to be able to tap into some of these pockets of expertise. I will also mention, though, that most, if not all of these entities also provide workshops for non-UNH groups. Some of them required a fee, some of them did not. And I know some of you are curious about costs. We were able to pull this off with a budget of about $2,500. Part of that was enabled because we got the friends and family discount with some of these USNH entities. But one of the things we will be reinforcing is that there are experts out there that who charge either very modest or no fees in order to get this information out. For our participants, we, as Ruth mentioned, we have a number of volunteer programs. During our first 2 years, we've been able to have representation from 11 out of the 15 different volunteer programs and 9 out of the 10 counties. So we're trying, of course, to make sure that we have a diversity among our cohort of volunteer participants. Not surprisingly, our participants are predominantly white. And a little greater than half are over the age of 65. And then there's another group just, between 35 and 65, and then a smaller number under the age of 34, 35. I would say, and I don't have the stats in front of me, but this would not be terribly unusual for our volunteer demographic overall, in terms of predominantly white and folks who are available during the day. So many retired folks were available during the day to work on programs. What is a little different is that in terms of this particular program, we saw a much higher percentage of female to male, folks who identify as female to male who participated in this particular program. And remember, at this point, people are self-selecting their participation. And when we looked at and again, being our first year, we were very curious about, okay, what's working? How are people engaging? What are they doing? So we just did a little analysis, and we found that for our 2021 year, where I have more of the data already taken into account, about 89% are actually participating in the live Zoom session. That's by far the big draw. But 2/3 are also participating in that pre-work online discussion. I don't know how many are actually accessing the pre-work. In other words, watching the videos, reading the material. We don't know that, but we do know that 2/3 of them are actually participating in discussion related to those materials. And in our first year, we actually had another opportunity for folks to participate in an online discussion after the live session. We found that less than a quarter of the participants were doing that. So for 2022, we dropped it. Now, I'm not sure with 2023, what we'll do, we might rejuvenate it, but I'm not sure. But it's been interesting to see where those, the heaviest amounts of participation were. So of course we did post program survey. And actually these, for the 2022 online surveys, so far I actually have 23 responses. The responses are still sort of dribbling in, which was an excellent response rate. We had an even higher response rate after our first year. But again, some of our results are still dribbling in. So today I'm going to be showing you the 2022 results to our online survey. Results overall, I would say for 2021 were very similar. So one of the questions we asked of our volunteers, right? Because typically, as many of you know, right, volunteers get involved in the work because they are interested in that particular topic, subject area, action. And we wanted to know, did they see DEIJA work as being relevant in addition to their content work? And here's what we're finding. Generally speaking, right, all 7 of the content areas rated either extremely or very relevant by at least 72% of the participants. So they are, at least our volunteers, are seeing this kind of work and this kind of knowledge and growing awareness as something that they can use in their volunteer work. We asked them about specific, basically our objectives, right, in terms of, we asked them to finish this sentence. Participating in this program has increased my knowledge about DEIJA concepts, my comfort level discussing these ideas with others, my comfort using DEIJA best practices, my motivation to help Extension become a more diverse, equitable, inclusive, and just organization, and lastly, my ability to help Extension become a more diverse and welcoming organization. So the highest areas of growth for 2022 were in the knowledge of the concepts, the motivation to help the organization, and their comfort level discussing these ideas and concepts with others. And these areas basically reflect the objectives that we set out for the program. Again, being our, a new program for us, we're very curious about, how are we hitting the mark in terms of what we're asking these volunteer participants, right, to do. So this was a new program. We know these participants are adult learners, and we have engaged them as volunteers who self-select. This was not a required program. So, and what we are finding out that at the level that we are providing or requiring, that clearly the level of information and the level of effort was mostly considered just right. The amount of time was considered just right, again, by most participants. And about a third, however, about a third of our participants, or respondents anyways, would appreciate having more opportunities for interacting. And that's something that as a project team, we've struggled a little bit with, trying to keep the time manageable, be able to convey the concepts and include enough opportunities for interaction. When we ask volunteers to select from a list of reactions, what they're thinking and feeling, the ones that came out at the top would be they're feeling welcomed, they're feeling curious, they're feeling safe, they're feeling motivated, supported, encouraged, and acknowledged. Fortunately, they're not feeling disinterested or bored, and a moderate number are feeling challenged and some a little confused. I'm thinking those are both pretty good considering the kind of material and the opportunities that we're discussing. In terms of other reactions, of course, we ask, so how did this meet or not meet your expectations? And about 90% reported that the program equaled or exceeded their expectations. We asked, would you be likely to recommend this to another volunteer that you work with? And most of them said they would be likely. And the remainder said they would. They added the qualifier that they would only if the other person seemed interested. Nothing shocking there, I don't think. So we did ask an open-ended question and ask people to identify one of the most important things that they learned. And during the 2021 program, this is what a word cloud looked like of the responses. And if you're not familiar with a word cloud, it's basically sort of a kind of a rough analysis tool. The larger the word, the larger the font, the more that word appears in a set of words. So you can see here what's really jumping out. We see bias. And that's because in that 2021 year, actually in both years, but there was a lot of treatment of explicit bias, implicit bias, structural bias. So this is not surprising, and we were really glad that folks are recognizing that. Other prominent words you may see, we see people, program, learn, implicit, aware, race, and issue. 2022, we did the same thing with that open-ended question. And it looks a little different, but you will see a lot of words repeated. Here, people is actually coming out as a little bit bigger. And interestingly, with our change in presenters, I certainly noticed there was like a little change in sort of approach. I would say the first year, some of our presenters maybe took a little bit more academic approach. Some of our second year presenters took a little bit more interactive approach. It's just interesting, and that's just my guesses in terms of interpretation. But you see many of the same words appear. And again, some other prominent words we see are learn, implicit, time, demography, change, understand, and work. Some other things that the 2021 participants offered. I'll give you a minute here just to look these over. You know, just asked to make other comments. And what I like about this set of comments is that, you know, we see a growing awareness, we see changes in how people are feeling, and we see changes in intent in terms of what people plan to do in the future with their actions. Again, with a pilot program, right? We were very curious, okay, how are people feeling in terms of satisfaction with the different program elements? Here we see very satisfied with the presenters, very satisfied with the pre-work, with the presentations, with the time of year. Again, it was that January to April. Mostly very satisfied with Zoom, and they actually, several of them commented that they liked the fact that extension staff were working as a team to support and deliver and coordinate this programming. In terms of mixed responses, some people loved the online learning platform, some did not, and that tended to be related to people's comfort with technology, I think. And again, Zoom, we did have people comment on what they might like to see in terms of staying the same or changes if this were to ever move into an in-person offering. And again, there's valid arguments on both ends. Whether to keep it virtual or to do it in person, or maybe some combination of the two. Size of the cohort, most people liked it. Some folks had a difference of opinion. Time of day was very interesting. As you saw on that Canvas sheet, we met from noon till 1:30. We were hoping for folks who have a working day that they could maybe participate during their lunch hour or their lunchtime. And that's what was behind that decision. It's very tricky to find a time of day that works for all people at all facets of their employment career or their life. And then the duration of the live sessions. Again, we tried to keep it sort of like not too huge of a commitment, but a substantial enough commitment that we could make a difference. Some of the things we're considering as we look at this into the future, folks have asked for opportunities to either role play difficult situations or to practice in 2022, practice some of the concepts and skills that they were learning. In 2022, we did add a new session that we didn't have on the first round, which did offer our participants a little bit more practice. Many folks would like more interaction, and we need to learn a little bit more about what would be involved with that, and more small group discussion. Some folks mentioned they'd prefer another time of day. Some folks were asking for a longer live session. And one of the things that our project team has thought about, and I would encourage any of you to think about, if you're thinking about, or if you already have this kind of program, I'd be curious to learn from you. What do you do with follow-up programming and support? Which we're trying to think like, how do we support these cohorts that have been through the training to continue in their growth. Is that our job to do that, or do we just encourage them to continue to reach out and to other sources of information and training within their communities, for example? We do have a list, of course, of recommendations and lessons learned. So you'll probably notice that a lot of these look very familiar. If you do any project or program development and planning, you're going to see a lot of familiar themes here. So in terms of assessing the situation and the need, two things that really rang out to us in our experience was that we found that our volunteers were hungry for this information and the support. They want to make a difference, not only through their volunteer content, but also in this realm as well. Another thing is to make sure, as Ruth laid out, we had a lot of support within our organization. We're working on our own stuff. We had a lot of support within our organization to include volunteers in that work. So do make sure that your program is justified and that your organization is really supportive of this, so that if you are ever questioned, that you have that backup. The topics can get sensitive and the organization needs to be able to back up the effort. In terms of the program design, just as you would for any project or program you're designing, remember, you pull together your project team and you identify your objectives. Having all this work done and written down on paper will help you in the future as the participants may question, or other folks. You'll figure out your methods based on your objectives. You'll have an evaluation plan, set up a budget, a timeline, identify your partners, and be thinking about how you will sustain this program or what you want to offer in the future. And then in terms of our actually developing and implementing the program, what we found for our, these initial efforts is that for right now, it's working for us to have volunteers self-select. We offer it. It's all voluntary, whether or not they want to come. At some point, might this be a required part of our training? Maybe, but at this point, it seems to be working as a volunteer. As many of you know who are in the work professionally, people come, this is lifelong work, right? And people come to it as they are ready and able. And if you remember nothing else about this presentation, remember to work with professional content providers. They're available both through public and private organizations. The reason we say that is because they have experience navigating sensitive topics. They're up to date on the evolving content and the terminology. They can deal with nuance and incomplete understandings. As you saw, right? People are describing like, this is challenging work, but it's worthwhile. Sometimes it's confusing, and that's all okay. We need to acknowledge the messiness. What we have learned, which was interesting from our content providers, was, and this kind of shocked me in the beginning, but now it makes perfect sense, is how delighted they were to be working with willing participants. So often they're called into an organization because something went wrong. And there might be their audience may be not completely buying in. So that was, I think, a real plus for our presenters, and it made it more of a pleasure for everybody to be able to engage in the work. Another thing we really learned the importance of is taking into account the demographics and the experience of our volunteers. I mean, I think we're fully aware of this, right? Our volunteers, again, they come from different backgrounds. They come from different life experiences. And it's just maybe your volunteers are high school students. Well, that's something to keep in mind. Or maybe they are multiple language speakers. That's something to take into consideration. What's their access and their familiarity with technology, for example, if you plan on doing virtual programming. So taking all of that into account is critically important. Employment status, socioeconomics, their education levels, their social identities, their cultural backgrounds, right? Their veteran status. Like, there's so many things that play into how people view this content and how they can participate in any kind of a program. We found our use of multiple modalities to be critically important because different people engage in different ways, right? Some folks were delightfully happy to be able to read materials, watch some videos, think about things, and maybe we're quiet during discussions, whereas other folks are interested and want much more of an engaged small group discussion. So having mixed modalities, videos, readings, discussions, independent work, group work, integrating arts and humanities, all of these really help people find their entree into the work. As we've mentioned, our participants were looking for opportunities for interaction and exploration of ideas. And again, we would always reinforce that you have some sort of a group agreement, touch base with it periodically, just acknowledging the messiness of the work, recognizing that safe spaces, right, are not always comfortable spaces. And then lastly, make some plans, of course, to evaluate your program. At a minimum, assess the results against your objectives, make the modifications, and then try again, right? Consider, and then one of the biggest things we learned is that our volunteers, which we maybe hadn't considered enough, is that our volunteers were looking for follow-up opportunities for continued growth and learning within the cohort, or what they were experiencing in terms of their extension. All right. So in terms of the practical, where can we find trainers to work with? Of course, the ones we are most familiar with are the ones through the University System of New Hampshire. And again, we were able to tap into some wonderful partners for this kind of a work, including New Hampshire Listens, which is part of the Carsey Institute, UNH's Office of Community Equity and Diversity, Northeast Passage, which is an entity on the Durham campus that works in particular with adaptive recreation. That's one of our most popular content areas, I would say, was the work we did about ability and disability. Keene University has a diversity and multiculturalism office. So all of these entities, and again, I think all of them also work with non-UNH entities in terms of providing training. UNH also has a professional development and training unit that's actually closely related to extension. These are typically considered for the business environment, but not exclusively. There is typically a fee. It's like a course that people can take. So that's another opportunity to maybe find trainers or find courses that are relevant for your groups. And then, of course, generically speaking, there are continuing education providers. For example, the Southern New Hampshire Area Health Education Center. And I know I've attended some of their trainings several years ago, and that sort of helped me in my learning. And then, of course, some of the nonprofits, for example, maybe the Diversity Workforce Coalition. I know they're a business-oriented organization, but I did see that they have they do some work with businesses on this kind of, on DEIJA topics. And then, of course, private consultants. And again, we're not, this is not a comprehensive list. We're not promoting or discouraging any particular provider. Private consultants, though, can help with anything from assessment to program implementation and evaluation, I would always ask for referrals and references. I know a few private consultants have been mentioned to me or to us as we've been doing this work because they're familiar to folks who are either on our staff or in our organizations. I will say costs can vary considerably. Our work with UNH Power Play. Oh, I forgot to list them. So that's a really important one. UNH Power Play is an applied theater group. In other words, they do educational theater. That's through UNH's Department of Theater and Dance. And it's several $1,000s to work with them, but they do an amazing job with their interactive theater work. And I wanted to make sure that we still have some time for questions or comments. Ruth, anything you see in the chat or that we want to bring up?
I do not see any questions in the chat, but if people have questions, they are certainly welcome to put them there or unmute if you want and raise questions about our program, what we did, Julie's presentation, follow-up that we're thinking about doing, anything that you want to know about how we did this and how it worked. It was really a pleasure to be part of this. I was part of the second year team. As Julia said, we had rotating teams of volunteer managers and folks like Julia who worked on this a lot. And it was an impressive amount of work, but having a team approach really sort of spread that work out and made it doable for all of us who have very full plates and very busy jobs and could never have done it on our own. So hats off to the team, which was a lot of fun to work with. Let's see, something just came in on chat. I wonder if you had some sessions with a wide range of ages and how that impacted the perception of the issues. I think that's asking about the ages of our volunteer participants, or is that asking about presenter ages? I'm not sure, but I think, okay, participants, thanks. So participants, as Julie mentioned, were pretty much a cross section of our volunteer corps, which tends to be on the older retired side. I was curious this morning in the keynote that the Bureau of Labor Statistics information that the speaker presented said that on US level, actually the 35 to 54 age range was the highest participation of volunteers. So that's not our experience at Extension. And we certainly have some younger volunteers, but the majority of our folks are in the retired set. Those are the folks that have time to volunteer most, right? So, so definitely on the older side in terms of our cohorts. Have you incorporated DEIJA content into general volunteer training onboarding process at all? Great question. As one of the managers who runs our largest volunteer program other than 4-H, we have incorporated into our Master Gardener training, diversity training. We do a couple of our programs are volunteers go through fairly intensive training over the course of 12 weeks, and that's true for the Master Gardeners. So we have developed a session on diversity to incorporate into that training. So all of the new cohorts of volunteer Master Gardeners that come through over the last couple of years and going forward will get at least a taste of diversity training. It's not the deep dive that this Together session offered, but it's a little teaser at least to let them know that it's important and there's a lot more to come. Julia.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. So right before this presentation today, I actually reached out to some colleagues and I said, how are we doing on, I've been so focused on this training program that I haven't had a chance to look at like our policies in terms of recruitment and recognition of our volunteers. And I think we are getting there. We're just working on that in terms of our own hiring practices, for example, within Extension with our staff. So the logical next step is actually to incorporate some of those same implement, right, and integrate better in terms of how we recruit and recognize and the care and feeding of volunteers, to incorporate more of that. So I think we'll be seeing more of that into the future.
Well, hopefully that answered that question. Next one is interested in the intersection of governance and decision-making processes with DEIJA and how we can shed light on unspoken norms within governing culture that can hurt our efforts toward inclusion. I'm getting a sense that this is addressing some of the legislative challenges that have come forward over the last bit of time. This is where having that support of your organization is really, really essential, and to make sure that from the administration on down, you are, supported in this effort, so that if there is any pushback, you have some ground to stand on. Structural bias, is that really, is that what you were looking at more?
Hi.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I was actually thinking just more about like different decision-making processes and like how meetings are conducted, and the ways in which we ensure all voices are heard and valued at the table, and there's not tokenism, and there's just how our decisions are made, and the clarity in which we and transparency of how we recruit new people to the board or onboard folks and orientations, just so that there's a lot of clarity, and there's not little cliques or unspoken norms that keep people from participating in and being heard. That's more kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah. No, Josh, that's a terrific question, and that's something that we've been asking ourselves. That's something that some of our volunteers have brought up, right? And that's a tricky one, because
really tricky,
right? By its nature,
Mm-hmm.
it's a luxury to volunteer, right? And what about the ways in which the other side of that is, of course, how is it that we are offering volunteer opportunity, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, full recognition. And I think approaches that we kind of have to take a deep breath, give ourselves a little grace and say, okay, we're going to chip away at this little by little and continue to take baby steps as we do personally, right? In terms of growth. It's lifelong work. It's like fitness. You don't like get there and coast, right?
Right.
It's about new habits. So that's a great question.
It is a great question. I think just an example of that, as I mentioned, the Master Gardener training is a long-term thing, and it's been traditionally offered during the day, during the week, pretty much tailored to retired folks. And we are now looking at how to broaden that to do some hybrid training and other modalities, other schedules, other opportunities that can reach a more diverse audience of potential volunteers. So as Julia said, we're all chipping away at it and trying to do a little bit here and there, because it is a journey, and taking on too much all at once can be dangerous. So I encourage people to think small and be successful and build on that. I guess the other thing is, a lot of that is really about awareness raising, and so much of what you talked about, Josh, is people don't even think about it. You're at a meeting, and it's always, I'll use this as an example. There are many examples, but the men who are speaking up more, not always, obviously, but often, and they don't even know that they're doing that until you call them on it. So awareness is the first step. Other questions? Hopefully this is helpful for folks as you think about what you might do with your own volunteers and organizations. As you probably got a sense from this presentation, it was not something that was done lightly or easily. It did take some time. So give yourself that permission to take the time to do it well, because it's worth it.